Ko te huramaka te maonga, ko mai makariri te awa, no oratahi ahau, ko Chris Jansen tako ingoa. Thanks for having me today, Jude and team. So yeah, my name's Chris and I'm part of Leadership Lab and pretty committed to collective leadership, as you said, Jude. Stephen and I were just saying that we're both not bosses. So we lead like a not boss. So I've got 7 minutes here. I'll put my timer on because if you know me, it's, I tend to rave on a bit. But I've got some slides. Little montage about myself. I just don't even want to go there except to say that I'm married to Lynn and have 2 daughters, Kobe, who's 16, and Briley, who's 13. Kobe got a license yesterday, which was exciting. But I live in Christchurch. I'm married to Auckland and I've lived all around the world. I was a secondary teacher, deputy principal, head of department, and these days I'm consultant at Leadership Lab and lecturer at uni. So this is one of my strong beliefs, and this is why we've picked this session today. So self-organisation and collective leadership is essential for all organisations and communities to thrive. And I just thought I'd unpack that a little bit. And particularly the word self-organisation, which to me is kind of synonymous with collective leadership. So one thing I've noticed is that sometimes change and transformation is carefully planned and well organised, and sometimes, I'm involved in that or others are involved in that, but it's, it's a planned initiative, change management process. But sometimes it's just about passionate people responding to an immediate need that they see in their place. So it's like a pop-up version of leadership. And that's really what I'm interested in talking about today. There's lots of examples. I mean, 10 years ago, this was our Christchurch experience. And as you know, we saw lots of pop-up leadership after that, from small, tiny initiatives like this. No one's paid this guy to do that, or this neighbour sharing his water with us, or all these students mobilising because they wanted to. And not only students, older people too, joining the student volunteer army. More than 50% of them were not students. And then sadly, more recently with the mosque attacks, we saw a massive mobilisation of people, and it was all self-organised. And I'm sure you're all part of that. And then right now and recently, we see this all around the world. And again, this is not mandated. This is a kind of a pop-up leadership collective moment, isn't it? Where people say, I believe in something, I want to represent that and do something about it, even though I'm not the boss. And even here in good old New Zealand, when we had the lockdown, we saw massive amounts of sort of collective self-managing leadership. We saw Zoom everywhere. We saw students having to, suddenly lead their own learning, which, was not necessarily experienced in schools all the time. And that actually went reasonably well. When you look at the data from the lockdown in New Zealand, the majority of students did really well on that. It's because of the self-management and the flexibility factor. So these are all examples of kind of this non-planned leadership or self-management, really. And I just have, committed a few years to actually exploring this phenomena because I think it's so powerful. And just going to share a few slides about this. One of the things that I've realised is that the way we think about leadership is changing, and it's sort of changing over the last few decades probably, but there's a different approach emerging. And if you look at this here, I'll pop both sides up. In Leadership Lab, we call this the big L and the little L. So the big L is your traditional leadership roles. And that's, I guess, if you're being really critical, that's the heroic leader. It's sort of often a man on a white horse with a flag charging into battle and everyone following them, charismatic, vision casting person. And yet on the right-hand side, you see this little L. This is not an individual person. This is a collective, it's a group of people mobilizing around something that's important to them. It's more action orientated than kind of position orientated. And so every photo I showed you before was an example of little L leadership, and it's by no means small, is it? But it's the little L as in the word leadership with the lowercase L. And I guess when I first thought about this, I kind of dismissed big L and thought, well, I see you later. That's a thing of the past. Let's go with collective leadership. The way I think about it these days is both are required, and we need to think about how to leverage off both sides of this. The reason for that, in my mind, is because we've got different ways we'd like to organise ourselves as humans. The machine on the left is kind of this way of organising, all right? And typically our schools and sort of formal organisations are organised that way. But the one on the right is the commemoration of birds. We don't fly around as humans, but we do organize ourselves in this kind of way. You know, our friendships, our social media, our associations, our interests are organized in non-hierarchical ways. And they behave in very different ways. The left-hand side is all about JDs and lines of communication and rank and, you know, positions of responsibility and all that. There's 1,000 words that go with that. And that's useful. But on the right, we've got this valid and completely different way of organizing, which is based on connections and common interests, and it's self-organizing, and it can grow and also disappear really easily. And these are both valid ways of organizing ourselves. And I've bolded the word self-organizing because that's really where the heart of collective leadership sits. It sits on the right-hand side here, right? Collective leadership is about mobilizing a network of people, right? And the reason why it's so critical these days, and like right now, it's even more important, is because of this kind of word VUCA, which has been around for a while. Not VUCA, it's VUCA, but it's basically describing our world. So volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. And if you think about it, you know, pre-COVID, it was VUCA, then COVID came along and it's just ridiculously VUCA-like. I mean, I don't know if you have any clue what's going to happen next year, because I certainly don't. And how do you plan? How do you lead into an environment in 2021 where we have no clue really what's going to happen? And so it's in the context of this kind of mega volatility and mega uncertainty that we really need to lean into collective leadership and self-organization, because the heroic way of working, or the individual leader with his job or her job description, which is defined, is completely overwhelmed by VUCA. And so that's where I return to that self-organization and collective leadership is essential for our organizations and communities to thrive. So our organizations, our schools, and all the other companies thrive if we can get the collective leadership within the school activated, but also our communities, right? Our communities and our cities thrive in the same way. So that's the big why for me. And I'm going to stop there and hand over to Stephen. He's going to talk about his why.
Tēnā koutou. No kōtarana ngā tupuna o tōku papa, no ingarani ngā tupuna o tōku mama. I tipu ake ahau ki te waihara keke, ka mihi au ki te tawa whenua me ona uri. Ka mihi au ki te maunga tapoe o unuku, ka mihi au ki te awa waio toa, ka mihi au ki te iwi o te rohe ko nai tahu. I grew up in Blenheim, so my ancestors are from Scotland and England, so I acknowledge the ancestors of the region of Blenheim, Mountain, Tapoe o Unuku, and the River Waiotoa. Ko Oitotahi toku kāinga i Nainei. Christchurch is my home now. Ko Stephen McConnachie ahau e mihi ana kia koutou. Cool. So my experience, I'll just start with a bit of background. My experience is, as a teacher, I spent a week in a couple of different schools, and then kind of was hired out and consulted to a bunch of other schools to influence those schools' own kind of digital transformation journeys. So all of my experience in leadership is in this collective model, some by choice and sometimes not by choice, but always in the context of what influence can I make, and what progress can we make as an organization when I personally am operating outside of that traditional leadership structure. So I'm going to start with building on, so Chris talked about some contemporary examples that we've seen in action in the last few years around Aotearoa. I want to put that collective leadership stuff in the context of some literature, and then unpack that a bit, especially for those who, like me, are operating in that less traditional model. So Dr. Selwyn Katene, in his book, The Spirit of Māori Leadership, he talked about the most important ingredient in an organization is the people. And Jim Collins would add, it's not just the people, it's the right people, having the right people. So Katene said that the people are the lifeblood of an organization. They're the ones who have the expertise, the talent, intelligence, knowledge, and creativity. The leader's job is to unleash that potential by igniting the fire within people, so that they can do whatever is necessary to accomplish tasks without compromising the group values and losing sight of the shared vision. So the group values and the shared vision. Now, as Ralph Nader said, the function of leadership is to produce more leaders, not more followers. So I want to take this from the stance of collective leadership is about building more leaders, while not sacrificing the vision of the end goals of the organization, but it actually works in tandem to improve that. So in a school setting, and any organization, I guess, there's layers of this igniting the fire. There's the head of department to their team of teachers. There's the senior leadership team to the heads of department and the deans maybe. There's the principal to the senior leadership team, but also, of course, the teacher to the students in their class. So we could look at this collective leadership as kind of through the lens of student-centered learning, saying let's move away from the teacher delivering the knowledge to the student. Let's move more to students are driving it. Students are co-constructing what the program might look like. Students are at the center of it. And so collective leadership, I guess, has some parallels to that as well. So back to the literature, Selwyn Katene identified these 4 parameters of successful transformation. He said, he looked through the futures literature and he said that these 4 things are likely to be reflected, these 4 parameters of leadership are likely to be reflected in a successful transformation in an organization. So sustainability, sustainable leadership sustains the leadership of others and develops rather than depletes human and material resources. It develops leadership capacity and leadership networks where innovation rather than standardization can flourish. So sustainability in the context of a school is looking at when that, schools often have high turnover, staff turnover. Is the underlying drive of that department or of that whole school likely to fall apart or change undeliberately, just float away when that specific key person leaves, or is it sustainable? The next one, organization. This is where you're increasing leadership capacity across an organization as a whole. So not just putting things in place so that the organization continues and that the vision continues, but actively increasing the leadership capacity of the whole organization. Acceleration. Now, this one's about seeing leadership as a deliberate professional choice. So anybody in the organization who is wanting to step into leadership or who is in leadership deliberately and consciously chooses leadership as their trade. So this is rather than just, I got promoted and therefore I'm a leader. This is, I'm a leader because I choose to be, and so I'm investing into that skill, into that trade. And the last one, distribution. So this is consider and invest time and effort in new organizational forms so that goals can benefit from a wider pool of expertise. Now, this relates back to what we were saying earlier about how the people have the knowledge and the creativity and the expertise. So collective leadership, that allows the organization to tap into all of that. Now, in a school setting, organizational forms are pretty entrenched. So consider how you might tap into the collective expertise in your existing organizational structure, and maybe what alternative organizational structures might help with that. Now, Jim Collins, so we've got Indigenous leadership on the one hand, and we've got Western tradition on the other. And Western leadership has started over the last few decades to realize that this collective leadership and what Selwyn Katene and Shelley Spiller and the world of Indigenous leadership literature have been saying and have known for generations. Western leadership's kind of catching up. And so Jim Collins in his book, Good to Great, they did, for those that are not familiar with the research, they looked at a whole bunch of organizations who had a transition point, a turning point. They had gone from good to great. They were pottering along, and then what was it? That was what Jim Collins tried to ascertain with his team. What was it that made that that turning point possible? And he found, I'm not going to go through all of these, I encourage you to go read the book, but he found that kind of different categories of types of leader. And that category 4, that level 4 leader, an effective leader, they're at the top of the good organizations. And so they are your typical leader is the boss, leader is the hero in our kind of vernacular for today, out with the hero, in with the collective. So the effective leader is your hero. It's all about them. They know the vision. They've communicated their vision to the team, they've gotten the team on board, they know where all the pieces of the puzzle are and they're driving it. But then that next level, the level 5 executives, they're the ones who took their organization from good to great. They're the ones who made that really, really exceptional organization. And a level 5 leader builds, this is Jim Collins' definition, builds enduring greatness through a paradoxical blend of personal humility and professional will. And it's that paradoxical blend that makes it difficult. So that balance of whakaaro, the humility that's such an essential component of wayfinding leadership and level 5 leadership, balancing that with the ability to make the tough calls, to inject the energy and momentum, to stand up and be counted as a leader. And as Chris was saying, it's not just about moving to little L leadership and not doing the big L anymore. It's balancing as the time requires. So the last thing I want to add as well is when Selwyn Katene and Jim Collins talk about sustainability and setting up the organization to flourish beyond the reign of the current leader, they're not trying to say that succession is the point of collective leadership. It's not just about succession and sustainability. We're not just talking about setting it up for the future. We're not sacrificing short-term productivity for long-term gain. This is a worthwhile and effective model for getting the best impact now and ensuring that that will last through as well. So I'm just going to share my screen here. These are some of the tips and strategies that that we might consider. And again, it's broken into the two types, those in formal leadership now and those who have influence or want to have influence, but don't yet have a formal position. So if you are in leadership, my top tip is ask more questions. If you're not yet in formal leadership, my top tip is ask more questions. I think that's so critical for making sure that it is a shared vision. It's not just a vision which has been clearly communicated. If you're in formal leadership, actively seek opportunities to delegate authority, let people run a project, go and kind of create a little task force. Create opportunities for leaders or for the people around you to become leaders and step into that leadership. If you are not yet in a position of formal leadership, then actively seek those opportunities to influence, but keeping in mind what both Jim Collins and the Indigenous leadership researchers that I've been reading were talking about whakaaro, the humility. So you're actively seeking opportunities to influence, but from a level 5 leadership, from a humble kind of mindset. If you are in formal leadership, seek feedback. I'm sure you're doing that already, but I think that's absolutely critical to tipping the balance into collective leadership. When you're seeking feedback, when you're not only on your own leadership, but also on the direction of the organization. Ask yourself how much of your current vision was co-constructed. Whose vision was it? Whose voices were part of that original vision kind of crafting, and whose voice is missing from that you might need to approach? And my biggest piece of advice is to those of you who, like me, didn't have a formal position of leadership, but wanting to influence and drive transformational change at huge scale. My advice to you is start now. As Selwyn Katene was saying, the acceleration of leadership, when you're actively, deliberately fostering your own leadership as a career choice, then just start now. Start your level 5 leadership, start your wayfinding leadership, look up on what your next step is as a leader, not just as a teacher or as whatever your other role is, whatever industry you're in. When you see that leadership is about doing all of this stuff, all of this mindset and servant leadership, you don't actually need a title for that. So hand it over to you, Chris.
Kia ora, Stephen. Thanks for that. Loving connecting with what you're saying and the connections between it. So for me, I put the top half of this up at the beginning. Self-organisation and collective leadership is essential for all. And this is obviously about how do you make that happen. And I like the way Stephen said, you know, there's two perspectives here. It's from the position of the big L, what can you do to grow collective leadership? There's also from the position of a little L, as in someone who's not in a leadership role, how do you actually grow collective? It's kind of the same phenomena, but from a different perspective. And in the flyer for this hui today, we said that it's about quietly and intentionally growing this kind of leadership throughout your organization. And the irony in this for me is that, you know how all the photos I showed you earlier about self-organization, the irony is it possible to lead that, or is it really self-organizing, right? And if it's self-organizing, is it sort of just spontaneous? Therefore, we have to kind of hope for the best that it might happen. And again, in my thinking about this, I'm really hoping that there is something we can do as individuals who might have a leadership role to grow this around us. And this has massively influenced my personal way of leading. And I want to share with you a way of thinking about this. And it comes from looking at other systems beyond or around our world. And some of you may have looked at these kind of patterns before. It's a murmuration or a swarm, and it's birds flying around. But to cut a long story short, there are different ways of collectivizing as species. And just like these are birds flying around, I guess the Black Lives Matter protests that happen around the world, they're not flying, but they're organizing in a similar way. And it's interesting to actually have a look at how does that happen? Is it magical, you know, it just happens, boom? Or is there something going on that actually makes it quite intentional? Now, this whole field of study in science is called complex adaptive systems. It's a big long name for this murmuration here. And what the scientists have found is that these four conditions are happening. So it's not like the birds just fly up and cruise around. These four conditions are what allows that to be not just a chaotic mess, but to be a complex pattern shape, right? So they're starting from the bottom. There has to be an attractor, in this case, a threat or an opportunity. There has to be decentralized control, so the birds can do whatever they want. There has to be interactions with neighbors, as in they have to like certain spacing. And they have to, independent agents, they have to not be bossed around. They have to be making their own choices. Now, if you take those conditions and think, well, what could a leader do, all right, to actually make those conditions happen? What we've done is taken the conditions on the left and thought about some of the common leadership roles that we already know on the right. And I'm just going to show you four ideas here of simple but profound things that I have practiced a lot in my own leadership in order to grow collective leadership around me. So the first one is, in blue, you can see the attractor, all right, the threat or the opportunity. Now, we obviously don't use threat, all right, but the opportunity is around what's the shared kaupapa or the reason why we need to exist or the problem we want to solve, all right? And that could be values-based, but it's also vision-based. And if I pop to the next slide to give you an idea, what's the compelling issue that would aggravate or invite us into coming together to solve this? And so in my facilitation of groups, I'll often phrase it in that way. What's the cup on the table? What's the reason we're here? What's the thing we have in common? Because you remember, networks only organize around common interests, right? That's the first one. Simple. Second one is interactions with neighbors. So if we want to have swarming or conflictive leadership going on, it's dependent on those lines between the different parts, you know, the lines on the network, and that is communication in the human world. So if we find ourselves running staff meetings, we're doing all the talking, we're not going to get collective leadership, right? But if we facilitate and create in all sorts of different ways dialogue and honest dialogue, so people can actually debate things, that process of dialogue or conversation grows the phenomena of collective leadership. And it's a bit like if you look at this here, often I'll just pop the whole slide up, but often our leadership dilemmas are we don't know what to do, that's the green cloud, and we don't know how to engage people in the thing we don't know how to do, which is a hell of a dilemma for leaders, right? We don't know what 2021 is going to look like, but we know if we don't engage people, it's not going to go well for us. And so through this process of fostering interaction or communication, dialogue, shared learning, what we end up doing is leveraging the collective brains in the staff room or in the team. And we get both better solutions because there's more brains, but we also get much, much better engagement because people feel a sense of ownership because they have contributed. Like Stephen said, who wrote the vision? Who was involved in that? Right? If it's just 5 people, you're going to have a problem ever to get collective leadership happening. Quickly popping on, developing independent agents in the human world. For me, this is about ensuring that all the people that I'm involved with are in the best state of well-being they can be, which means paying attention to well-being, means checking in with people informally. It means caring for people and noticing people. And lastly, it's about distributing power. And because when you have a big L leadership role, you do have a job description with certain powers, certain portfolios, and it's about choosing to give some of that away. Not all of it, you do it bit by bit, but it's about sharing and divesting decision-making and doing decision-making collectively. Last quote, you probably know this, but this is the epitome of collective leadership. Just let you have a quick read. And the real irony of collective leadership is if you do it really, really, really well, no one will have a clue that you were there, right? And then obviously that's a bit of an ego challenge for us because we don't get any acknowledgement, but that's the sign of the ultimate in collective leadership.